So we're in the home stretch of the day. Arguably, two very exciting sessions coming up. The first one here, we've got a very special guest, Katharine Hayhoe, to join us, join Sean for a fireside chat here. We're thinking of a real fire, but maybe next time. Couldn't find anyone to buy the credits for that. So, Katharine Hayhoe is an accomplished atmospheric scientist who studies climate change and why it matters. She has been featured as one of the Time magazine's 100 most influential people, Foreign Policy's 100 leading thinkers, and Fortune magazine's world's greatest leaders. Her TED Talk, The Most Important Thing You Can Do to Fight Climate Change is to Talk About It, has more than 4 million views. She recently authored Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World, and serves as Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy. She is both a Paul W. Horn Distinguished Professor and the Political Science Endowed Professor in Public Policy and Public Law at Texas Tech University. She has a degree in physics from the University of Toronto and a master's and doctorate in atmospheric science from the University of Illinois. Please join me in welcoming up Katharine Hayhoe and Sean McCoy. And we're doing questions a little differently for this session. So if you use the Slido link, you can submit your questions. Sean's going to be monitoring them and picking them up from time to time to throw into the conversation. So please do submit your questions through Slido. Thanks.
And if you haven't paid me, I don't know if I'll be asking it. I'm just kidding. Okay.
We accept Venmo.
yeah, anything. That's right. No, I kid. So thank you very much for joining us, and it's really fortuitous that you were able to make it. So this is really exciting.
Well, thank you very much to Carson. So if you know, when I travel, I don't travel in person unless I can bundle enough events together to make the time carbon worthwhile. And so I knew I was coming to Calgary because I was speaking at the Rotary International Convention this morning in the Saddle Dome with Rotarians from all around the world. And so I've been there with them all day. And then I'm doing a bunch of events yesterday, doing some more tomorrow. But I had this 2-hour window this afternoon. So I said on Blue Sky, which if you're not on Blue Sky already, I highly recommend it. I said on Blue Sky, hey, I've got these 2 hours. Is anybody interested? And Carson was like, yes, as a matter of fact. So here I am, which is awesome.
Yeah, this is fantastic. I got to get in Blue Sky anyway.
Yes, you do.
Good. Yeah. So what we thought we'd do is just have a chat, have a little bit of a discussion as the questions come in. We'll start asking them. So yeah, one of the things that I noticed here in Calgary yesterday is, I don't know if anyone noticed how the smoke just kind of blew in the middle of the day, right? And I went outside and I said, oh, it's fire smoke. Oh, right? And so many of us, right, are being impacted like indirectly and directly, right, by wildfires. There's been a lot over the past few years. So do these disasters, right, I think we could characterize climate-related disasters.
I think so.
Yeah. Do they open a window for us to talk to people about climate? Or is that something which, you kind of have to approach very carefully? What do you think?
They absolutely do. Now, with the caveat that if somebody is literally trying to escape from their home because it will be burnt down, that is not the time to have a discussion about the long-term impacts of climate change. But if they are safe and they have not recently lost something that really matters to them, like their home, then this is actually the perfect time to have a conversation, because we always react to what's sort of top of mind. And sadly, these days, disasters are top of mind. So, insured disasters here in Canada, they've doubled in the last 20 years. In the US, the increase is even more stark. They've gone from $4 billion weather and climate disasters, $3 billion weather and climate disasters a month in the 80s to 1 every 2 weeks today. And so that means that there's a conversation to be had about something that affects us personally. So it's not about the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. It's not about Greenland or Iceland. It's not about polar bears. It's about my life. My insurance rate just went up 50%. My family had to evacuate. My kid can't breathe this air. It's a really, really good conversation starter because it immediately connects with someone's lived experience.
Yeah. And I don't know if has anyone in the room tried to have that conversation with anybody? Put up your hand if you have. Anyone? I know I've personally been reluctant to do it, but I'm glad people are doing it.
I'll tell you a good opener that I often use. I mean, obviously, if there's wildfire smoke in the air, you can say, wow, look at the smoke today, obviously. But I often ask people, do you feel like the weather has gotten weirder? How long have you lived here? What do you do here? And do you feel like the weather's gotten weirder? And everybody has a story to tell. And when we have these conversations, it's actually more important that people feel like they are listened to and validated than it is that we get them to validate us. So just asking people for their lived experience and listening to it and validating it can be so powerful.
Yeah. One of the things when you talk to people, or maybe you've had this experience or others have had this experience, is right, we have a lot of politics that are happening right now. We have a political climate, which kind of, I feel like, makes these conversations particularly tricky, particularly as a pre-tenure assistant professor for a few more days anyway. And so, like, is the situation, is it a barrier or is there an opportunity to talk to people? How do you approach people when you think of this political climate we're in?
Well, it definitely is a barrier because there's just certain words that if you say the words, they just immediately sort of trigger, no, I don't want to talk about that. That's not my thing. But if we really focus on the issues rather than the words, I think we can still have these conversations very effectively. And I'll give you an example. So I live in Texas, which of course is the Alberta of the US. And a number of years ago, I was invited. I've had a lot of very interesting speaking engagements, to put it mildly. But one of them that I'm thinking of now in terms of how to have these conversations was to speak to all of the water managers in Texas. Now, there's about 350 water managers, and water is actually much more valuable in Texas than oil. Water is monitored very carefully. It is modeled very explicitly. It is planned for the next 100 years. It is worth its weight in gold. So they asked me to speak about the future of water in Texas at their conference. And I mean, I am a climate scientist, so that was part of my introduction. I couldn't exactly get away from that. But I decided to try something different that time. I decided to try to give a whole talk that included historical trends and future projections, as well as resilience and adaptation, without ever mentioning the words climate and change in sequence. I could say, long-term trends and climate variability, but I wanted to never say climate change and definitely not global warming. So first of all, they had a state senator who openly says climate change isn't real. Then they had a state representative who also says climate change isn't real. And then they had me. So I got up there and I gave my whole presentation, which had all of the data and information I would give if I was giving a talk on that here, except for that I decided not to use climate change. And first of all, nobody threw anything, and I was not heckled, which is always a good thing. But then afterwards, I will never forget, this woman came running up to me. She was this older woman wearing like a tweed suit. And she grabbed my hand and she shook it like this. And she was like, "That was great. I agree with everything you said." And then she said, "Those people who talk about global warming, I don't agree with them at all." But this made sense. And so that's the power of really like speaking to the issues rather than being insistent on we have to all agree on these words or these phrases.
So do you see other parallels? You talk about Texas, you've been here in Alberta, you're Canadian, you know Alberta, right? So what do you see as parallels between Texas and Alberta?
Oh, there's huge parallels. And one of the things that we see very powerfully here is Alberta is where we really saw the polarization of the science emerging clearly in Canada. 25 years ago, that wasn't really much of a thing here, and it really honestly wasn't even much of a thing in the US 35 years ago. But I remember looking in 2018, the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication did these great maps of Canada by riding, showing how many people in each riding agreed that climate was changing, humans were responsible, the impacts were serious, and then talking about support for solutions. And that map had almost a 100% correlation with the parties that won each riding in the 2019 election. So that was frankly horrifying to me. I expected it in Texas. I didn't expect it so much here. But we see that there's this polarization because the reason why people are rejecting the problem is because they don't think there's solutions they can get on board with. And in a province where not all, but a large percentage of the economy, the jobs, the people's even identity depends on the fossil fuel industry, they feel like they don't see themselves in a future that doesn't include fossil fuels. And then the reasoning kind of goes like this. If I don't want to fix it, but I'm a good person and a reasonable person and a rational person, so if I'm good and reasonable and rational, I don't want to fix it, then it can't actually be that bad. Or maybe it isn't even real. Or maybe we don't have to worry about it yet, or those scientists are just making it up to line their pockets. So we rationalize our objections based on not wanting to fix it. And I see that here, and I see that in Texas. And we'll talk a little bit more about how CDR can be part of that rationalization. But a key difference I see between Alberta and Texas, which fascinates me, is the investment in clean energy. So Texas has been #1 in wind in the US for 15 years, just overtook California last year for the #1 in utility scale solar. Texas has 5 different energy storage innovations on the grid already, from gravity storage to pumped underground storage. We've got 2 virtual power plants already on the grid, where it's like people's homes and batteries that get put together to actually create a virtual power plant. The new deep geothermal is going gangbusters in Texas because the skills you need to drill for deep geothermal are the same skills you need for oil and gas. So Texas is a place of incredible innovation and diversity in energy sources, which is fascinating to me, despite the fact that every couple of years the state representatives try to introduce a bill to make it harder. It makes it through one part of the government and not the second one. And so why couldn't the same characteristics that make Texas and Alberta so similar, why could they not lead to Alberta becoming a hotbed of innovation the way Texas is my question.
Thoughts? I think that's a good question, right? And we've been talking about that a bit today, about why we can't have more innovation here, right? In things like carbon dioxide removal, and maybe we have CCS as well, but in terms of renewables, we seem to be right now in a bit of a pickle with that politically, And maybe we can turn and talk a little bit about CDR as a tool, right? So, we think we're in early stages of talking about CDR, right? And so, how do we talk about that this important tool in the climate toolbox right now where we are? Is there a risk in talking about it? Like, how do we approach that?
Yeah, so this is challenging. I'm glad we're talking about this. It's something I've thought about for a while. I've had a bunch of chats with Climeworks. Somebody here from Climeworks, right? No? Thought there was. And then they've just moved to Texas as well. And I really like the way they talk about it very clearly and very transparently, because we have to be very clear about what CDR can and can't do. So the way that I describe it to people is, first of all, when it comes to climate solutions, there's no silver bullet, but there's a lot of silver buckshot. But the challenge is that the more worried people get and the more helpless they feel. And in Canada, after our wildfire season 2 years ago, people's level of prioritization of climate action plummeted, because the worse the impacts get, the less we feel we can do anything about them. So like in the last election, I think 70% of the population said, of course I'm worried about climate change, but I'm not voting based on that because there's nothing we can do. So I'm just going to vote based on the price of housing and the price of eggs, so to speak. And it's like, well, what do you think is affecting these things? So the more helpless we feel, the more we're searching for that silver bullet. And so there are headlines, which I'm sure many of you have seen, basically touting technological solutions like CDR as a silver bullet. And the more worried people get, the more they're trying to cling to and find silver bullets. So it's really clear, to be precise, that there is no silver bullet, but there is a lot of silver buckshot, and this is one of them. So in order to sort of parse out climate solutions, I like to use the metaphor of a swimming pool. An above-ground swimming pool, like I grew up with in our backyard in Toronto, where my toes just touched the ground when I was 9 years old. So if you think of the pool as the atmosphere, and the level of water in the pool is the level of carbon in the atmosphere. About 200 years ago, we stuck a hose in the swimming pool, and we've been turning the hose up every year. So not only is the water rising, it's rising faster and faster because more and more water is coming out of the hose every year. So we have to stop turning the hose up, and then we have to start turning the hose down. How do we do that? There's many ways. Efficiency is one of them. Something like 35% of fossil fuels are used to transport fossil fuels. We're very inefficient in the way we use our energy and our food and many other things like that. Clean energy, behavioral change, climate-smart agriculture, land use change, all of these go into turning the hose off. And then the way I think about it is, for the last few drops out of the hose that we can't get rid of any other way, it's like you cut a little slit in the hose before it reaches the pool. You suck those few drops out at what is currently great expense and great amount of effort, and you bury it underground, carbon capture. Our pool has a drain. And that drain can be made bigger to take more carbon out of the atmosphere faster. One of the biggest ways the drain can be made bigger is through investing in nature. And people often say tree planting, and that's one of them, but the biggest one at the top is just preserving the ecosystems we already have, the massive carbon stocks in the peatlands of the peat forests of Indonesia, for example, preventing those from being logged. Then restoring the ecosystems that have become degraded, regenerating the ones that have been destroyed. Then we've got climate smart agriculture, which is ways to, over years to decades, move carbon out of the atmosphere to help lower our warming rates. And interestingly, in Canada, Nature United did a study a few years ago showing that the greatest potential for nature-based solutions in Canada is not in forest, but rather in ag, which is very different than the case in the US. And then, for the last few drops down the drain, at great effort and currently great expense, you suck the carbon out of the atmosphere through direct air capture and do something with it. And then there's one more thing we have to do. The level of water in the pool is so high that many people can't swim. So we have to help people learn how to swim, which is adaptation and resilience. So that's sort of the framework that I talk about it with, and it makes it very clear there's a role for cutting a slit in the hose and sucking a few drops out. There's a role for making the drain bigger any way we can through technological solutions as well as nature-based solutions. But anybody who tries to say, and unfortunately people do, number one, it's a silver bullet. That's all we need to do. Or even worse, like the president of one of the Texas petroleum companies said, we will continue to increase our production through 2070 because don't worry, we'll just store all the carbon. And it's like, well, right now you're storing zero and you have no plan to store any more than zero for the next number of years. So people are using it, first of all, as a life raft to clutch to when they feel worried and afraid. And then, I mean, that's a very innocent, but still ultimately non-productive way to talk about it. And then, sadly, people are using it as an excuse to keep on going. It's like, oh, they've discovered a weight loss drug, so I will continue to eat 50 pounds of food a day. That just is not the way it works. So I think being really tempered and measured about how this is not the silver bullet, but it's not nothing. It's in between. It's one of the solutions we need. And right now we have a lot of things like efficiency and solar energy, for example, that you can implement like that, and nature-based solutions, but we need to be ramping up these solutions so that when we get to the point where it's like, ooh, we still have stuff coming out of the hose, we still need to take more carbon down the drain, we've maxed out on the land area that we can work with nature, for example, we need more, we need to be ready.
Should I ask you a question about bioenergy CCS? Right? Because you just brought up nature-based solutions, and then we have this intersection. You talked about direct air capture. Yeah. How does that fit into things in your thinking about it?
Well, that's another that's another silver bullet. Mm-hmm. You have to do the full life cycle and full cost analysis on those things. Mm-hmm. And in some places, it just doesn't add up, and in other places, it does. Mm-hmm. So again, in addition to there being no silver bullet, there's no one size fits all. There just isn't. Every region is different, every economy is different, every society is different, and so we need the biggest possible slate of options so that the set of solutions can be optimized and maximized and implemented most quickly and most efficiently for every organization, location, and so on.
Right. Yeah. So then if you had one message that you want to give policymakers on the topic of CDR, I think you might have alluded to it. What would it be? Would it be it's not a silver bullet?
I would say it's not a silver bullet, and you cannot continue business as usual. You just can't. The math is just not there. Because a lot of people are trying to grasp onto that. But it is one tool in a very full toolbox of items that together give us everything we need to tackle this issue at scale. Okay. That's the real hope.
Yeah, I agree. So maybe we have a couple questions here that have been voted up. I see David's question, David Wright's question in the back is a couple thumbs up. So I'm gonna put that out there because the G7, right, was just hosted right near here. No one was anywhere near it, including bears apparently. And so the communique had nothing to do with climate.
Yeah.
Not even talked about at all. So how do you keep this on the radar at that level? Do you?
Well, we have to, and here's the challenge. For so long, we've talked about climate as if it's its own separate issue, almost like its own separate bucket. And if you are a leader in charge of anything, you know that you have multiple buckets. In fact, if you're a human, you have multiple buckets. You have, your family, your health, what's going on with your parents or whatever, volunteer effort and your job and this and that. So when you think about leaders, whether it's a leader of a private organization or a university or a country or province or city or whatever, they have a lot of different buckets going. And then they've got this climate bucket that is necessary but not always apparently the most urgent bucket. And often they're like, well, I just don't have the time and the money. I've already, I'm addressing all of these buckets. By the time I get here, I've run out. Climate change is not another bucket at the end of the line. We've been talking about it all wrong. The only reason we care about climate change is because it is the hole in every other bucket. I mean, think about it. If the planet were warming, but that was the only thing that was happening, nothing else was happening. It was not affecting food, water, ecosystems, air, none of that was being affected. It was just warming. It'd be like, oh, scientific curiosity. How interesting, right? Be talking about it at AGU and nowhere else. The reason we care about it is because it's literally affecting the air we breathe and the water we drink and the food we eat and all of our infrastructure that was built for a planet that doesn't exist anymore. It takes issues like poverty, hunger, health issues, and inequality and makes them worse. Every single issue that people have a bucket on, including obviously the economy, it's making it worse. Just last year, they estimated that extreme weather events were costing the global economy $2 trillion a year. Well, guess what? This year, they estimate it's costing the United States $1 trillion a year every year, instead of $2 trillion for the globe in a decade. So, it's affecting every aspect of what we're doing, and it's if we leave it out of the picture, eventually the hole gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you can never fill any bucket. But the challenge we have, of course, is that elected terms are quite short. Our human attention span is even shorter. And so we are psychologically, and I would say even physiologically, unsuited to deal with these longer term issues. And that's what we're seeing reflected in these discussions is people, even someone like Mark Carney, who's very fully aware of the necessity of climate action, he's not alone. I've spoken with many people like that who are very on board with climate action. They still see it as a separate bucket. And until we realize that it's not the case of, well, I have 18 priorities and climate change is number 14 and I need to move it up to number 3. No, climate change shouldn't even be on the list of priorities because if you tell me any priorities you have, literally, I can tell you how every single one of them is being affected by climate change. Yeah. So as the military calls it, they call it a threat multiplier, and I think that's a great description.
So how do you balance in this conversation, we think about mitigation, right? And, trying to fix our buckets, basically, right? I mean, patch the hole, yeah. How do we talk about adaptation? Is that, is that a sign you're giving up?
Well, no. So I am a climate adaptation scientist, just to be clear. That's what I do. I generate high-resolution climate projections. I work with cities and with organizations to help build resilience. So it's like we've been smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for years and even decades. And so we have some lung capacity damage. We're not going to win the Olympics anymore. But we don't have emphysema, we don't have lung cancer, and we're not dead. So when's the best time to stop smoking? As soon as possible, as much as possible. But we have to cope with the fact that, we have some lung damage. And that's where we are today. We have damage that is already occurring right here, the flooding, the wildfires, the smoke, the extreme heat that's enveloping much of the US today, the collapse of glaciers and thawing of permafrost that's affecting everything from what just happened here to what happened in Switzerland a few weeks ago. So we are already bearing the brunt of these impacts. We have to adapt. But if we don't mitigate, we will not be able to adapt. Because as far back as we can go in the paleoclimate record, the closest analogy to today is about 55 million years ago, right? And it's hard to get a real hold on how quickly things were changing that long ago, and many of you here in this room are probably greater experts than I am on that. But the best understanding is that what's happening today, the change is occurring maybe about 10 times faster than it was back then. And of course, you didn't have 8 billion people on the planet at that point. So I think John Holdren said it best. He was Obama's science advisor. He said, we have 3 choices: mitigation, adaptation, or suffering. And we're going to do some of each. The only question is what the mix is going to be. Because the more we mitigate, the less adaptation is required and the less suffering there will be.
Yeah. Heavy. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, so there's some questions coming up here about wildfires. So maybe we opened and talked about that, and I'm wondering about so we saw some figures talking about the rate of now emissions that our forests are turning from sinks into sources in Canada. That and some slides talking about this as almost being greater than fossil emissions from oil sands operations lately, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, what's your take on that in terms of this? Is this how do we think about that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So, our forests actually switched over from being sinks to sources, I think almost 20 years ago now. But it has really taken off the last few years. Because, of course, when you burn large amounts of vegetation, it releases all the carbon in the vegetation into the atmosphere. Now, I know that a few people will argue with me on this, but as somebody who's done a lot of work on biogeochemical cycles and greenhouse gases, that carbon is not really one-for-one the same as the carbon emitted by fossil fuels, because the carbon emitted by trees, number one, was taken out of the atmosphere relatively recently, like within decades, whereas the carbon in the ground has been there for millions of years. Number two, there is some regrowth. So when you're talking about carbon emissions from forests, you really have to look at the net, which is everything that was emitted, but then what was taken back by regrowth. Which is not necessarily going to be one-for-one at all, and it's going to take a lot longer to take back than it was to burn. But it's a bit of a different animal. But then the other way to look at it is, a year ago last May, there was a attribution study that found that 37% of the area burned across Western North America, including Canada and the US, since the 1980s, could be attributed to the emissions from 88 corporations. So the other way to look at this is to add the emissions from the wildfires to the emissions of the companies that caused it.
So there's a question actually that links to this that someone's asked. So how do we so I know you advocate a lot for talking to people and having those conversations, but you kind of just sort of alluded to, well, we got to stick it to the corporations that caused this problem. How do you balance that? The people versus the corporations, versus the government. How do we attack the climate problem most effectively in your view?
Yeah, so all too often, I alluded earlier to how the more worried we are, the more we look for silver bullets. And I have people who will argue tooth and nail with me, I had one this morning actually, that if we all just were vegan, that would fix the climate problem. And don't get me wrong, meat is responsible for a hefty share of greenhouse gas emissions, but there is no silver bullet. There are some people that will argue that CDR would do it all, or that carbon capture would do it all. There's some people that would argue that if we have less children, that would do it all. It's like, yeah, good luck. We actually have the problem now, right now. Not to mention the fact that most of the people who say that are men, and I'm like, that raises a whole other issue there. Don't go there. So the more worried we are, the more we try to seize on a solution, but also the more worried we are, and I unfortunately have seen this on social media just taking off in the last 3 years. The more worried we are, the more we want to feel better for just a second by judging someone else. And so I remember the very first time I came to Calgary, which was just before the pandemic. I had a crazy bundle of events in Edmonton and Calgary I did. I put on Twitter back then that I was coming here and all the events I was doing. And immediately somebody from Leeds responded. And if you know Leeds, that's a very sustainable, they have a lot of people there who do sustainability. Somebody from Leeds responded saying, "Why aren't you taking the train?" So with the clear implication that I was a hypocrite for not doing so, obviously. So I was like, okay, I'm going to look at this. I live in Lubbock, Texas. The closest train station is 6 hours away. So I would drive 6 hours to Oklahoma City, after which I would take a train to New York. Then from New York, I would take the train to Toronto. Then from Toronto, I would take the train to Calgary. And if you got on a train from Leeds, by the time you got to Novosibirsk, you'd be halfway to Calgary. So it didn't make me want to take the train. It made me want to be like, oh, here's a picture of me at the airport. Here's a picture of me on the plane. Here's a picture of me in Calgary a couple hours later instead of 72 hours later. Yeah. When we judge each other, we actually drive each other apart. And often, sadly, aiming your arrow, so to speak, at somebody whose arrow is pointing in the same direction is becoming more and more and more common. Like, you shouldn't have said this, you shouldn't have done this. And it's a way of trying to make ourselves feel temporarily better, when the real issue is we don't have the policies in place that make the systemic changes that we need. So that's why when people say, well, what's the most important thing I can do? The number one answer is sadly still recycling. Yes, which of course really does nothing for carbon. But then people say, oh, well, what I eat or what I drive. And I'm like, no, it's not anything that you do. It's not your personal carbon footprint that's the most important thing. The most important thing we have to do is use our voice, because history shows us that when we use our voices to call for change, that is the only time when societal change occurs at the scale we need in the direction that we need today. So that is why using our voice is so, so, so powerful. And part of our using our voice is to call out the organizations, not so much the people who are responsible, but also to use our voice. You know, politicians underestimate how much people care because they never hear from them. So I was actually at my parents' in Etobicoke when our MP knocked on the door. I was like, ooh, Yvonne, here you are. So we had a lovely chat. He's a Liberal MP, but I felt the Liberals could do more, so we had a good conversation about that. When we use our voice to call for these large-scale changes, then, you know, at a lot of these companies, for example, there's people who want to do the right thing. Just as one final example, in this past fall, I was invited to speak to the Meat Institute. The Meat Institute, in the past, 10 or 15 years ago, has been caught doing the same dirty tricks as the fossil fuel industry in terms of misinformation and things like that. But there was somebody I trusted from Maple Leaf Foods who had invited me, and so I decided I would go, but I wasn't sure how people were thinking, and so I did one of those 6 Americas survey where you ask if people are alarmed or concerned or cautious or dismissive or disengaged. 90% of people were alarmed and concerned at the Meat Institute about climate change. So we had amazing conversations about what they are doing to try to reduce the carbon footprint and increase the sustainability of their industry, which they know best. So there's people at these organizations who are trying to change from within. Using our voice is so powerful, and when we guilt each other personally, that's not going to move us in the right direction. What is trying to figure out what do we have in common, where do we both want to go, and how can we work together to get there.
Great.
Yes,
Well,
we're seeing
yeah, I think we're seeing the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this has been excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you for being someone who uses your voice here today with us and more generally. We appreciate you stopping by, and it was really fortunate this all worked out.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here.